Richard Dick Hallorann was a surprise entry in Welcome to Derry. The novel did have him in a small role as a cook who co-founded the Black Spot nightclub, but the show has elevated him to a major role and no one's complaining. He's best known for his bond with Danny Torrance from The Shining and Dr. Sleep stories, which is where he became something of a moral compass for Stephen King's rather dark sagas filled with all kinds of evil that comes and goes in cycles. Welcome to Derry's Hallorann is a man walking on the path to becoming that empathetic, kind, and selfless man we'd later see, but yeah, this guy has an extremely troubled and abusive childhood, that too because of his own grandfather. That's what we're here to explore. The entire history of Dick Hallorann and Stephen King's Multiverse. But before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of those marvelous videos. Now, let's begin. Origins, childhood trauma, and the birth of the Shine. Let us begin by clarifying that most of the major characters in the Stephen King stories aren't given a prominent or detailed backstory, mostly because these guys are characters from novels and not comics, which have a broader scope when it comes to expansion of the lore. In comics, one person writes a story and then the publication gets someone else to write a prequel, and that's relatively easier than writing a prequel novel, which has to be written by the same author. That's why Dick Hallorann's past life, or even his childhood, isn't very clearly defined. However, that doesn't mean that we don't know anything about it. See, in Dr. Sleep, which is basically a direct sequel to The Shining, Dick meets Danny once more. He gets a call from Wendy Torrance, Jack Torrance's wife. You recall, Jack is the guy who got possessed by the hotel in The Shining. So it had been previously established in The Shining that Danny had the supernatural ability called The Shining, which allowed the user to speak to others with the same ability, in addition to seeing other supernatural things like the dead. In Dr. Sleep, Danny was now living with his mother, and it had been quite some time since the events at the Overlook Hotel, which were a series of harrowing events that Dick and Danny shared together and survived, at least in the book and the miniseries. Stanley Kubrick's movie actually killed Dick off, which was one of the changes that Stephen King didn't like. That's the reason why he wrote the miniseries, so that it would align more with his book. Anyways, Danny was seeing Mrs. Massey, woman from room 127 of the Overlook Hotel. She was obviously decomposing and bloating and sitting on his toilet, a sight that scared the living hell out of a young Danny. Danny warns his mother about ominous things lying ahead in the future, and on top of that, Wendy finds evidence of Mrs. Massey's presence in Danny's bathroom. That's why she calls Dick to seek his help in comforting her son in any manner possible. Being the moral compass and the embodiment of goodness in many of Stephen King's works, Dick Hallorann obliges and arrives at the Torrance residence to speak with Danny. On most occasions, the only effective way to connect to a child is through empathy. That's why Dick decides to tell Danny about his own childhood, more specifically about his grandparents, and it's here that we learn of Dick's child. Dick tells Danny of his paternal grandmother, Rose Hallorann, same lady we also saw in the 4th episode of It, Welcome to Derry. It turns out that Rose also shared Dick's shining ability, or the Shine. The lady has always guided Dick through his tough times and times of dire need. Even in the episode titled The Great Swirling Apparatus of Our Planet's Function, we learn that Rose had appeared before Dick to warn him, be careful about what's to come. Anyways, Dick also tells Danny about his grandfather, so evil that Dick took to calling him Black Grandpa, called Rose his white grandma. These colors didn't have anything to do with skin color, but rather the color of their hearts and souls. With young Dick, black and white, and evil and good, darkness and light. While his white grandma was this pure soul who loved him like a child should be loved, his granddad was this evil old man who abused Dick mentally, physically, even sexually. Of course, it wasn't a one-time thing. Dick had to endure this torture routinely at the hands of his black grandpa. The question one might ask is, why did Dick choose to keep this ordeal a secret? Well, he was told by Black Grandpa that if word got out, it would be taken away by a child snatcher called Charlie Manx. Interestingly enough, Charlie Manx is the main villain on AMC's NOS 4A2. Manx is a powerful creative, feeds off of children's souls, deposits what remains of them into Christmas land. Twisted Christmas village of Manx's imagination, every day is Christmas and unhappiness is against the law. It's a neat little reference and we appreciate it. Anyways, this story scared young Dick and he kept sustaining the abuse without telling a living soul about it, and Grandpa died and you would think that the torture would stop, right? No, Dick's dead black grandpa started to appear before Dick in several shining encounters. Each time, the dead old man was super naked and super sexualized. His spirit. Furthermore, this evil spirit would actually ask Dick to have sex with him. I mean, can't get weirder than that, right? But that was the troubled childhood that Dick Hallorann experienced. Lived to tell the tale. Hey, his later years, he was going to face even more versions of evil, starting with his encounter with the It entity. The Black Spot Incident. It, Surviving the Derry Inferno. We already know that Andy Muschietti, who made the two It movies, actually changed the timeline from the book. You see, the book is set in 1957 and 58 and 1984 and 85, whereas the movies take place in 1988 and 89 and 2016. This was done because Stranger Things had released a year ago and people were in love with the 80s nostalgia. Naturally, even the TV show is following this revised timeline and is based in the year 1962. But why are we telling you all this? Well, the simple reason is that Dick Hallorann's character is played with slightly differently in both versions, that is, the book and the prequel HBO show. Let's first talk about what happened in the book. After he grew up, Dick joined the U.S. Army and was assigned to serve as a cook for a New Hampshire-based unit called the East Company. Since then, cooking became one of his greatest skills, something he parlayed for the rest of his life, eventually serving at the Overlook Hotel. Dick also joined a few of his Black Army buddies into opening the Black Spot, a place where black soldiers could blow off some steam because everywhere else that they went looked at them with judgy eyes or simply asked them to leave. The Black Spot soon rose from the status of bar to nightclub, and as its popularity increased, it started catering to the local residents of Derry, in addition to the black soldiers. However, as fate would have it, Black Spot irked some of the super racists of Maine. People from an organization called the Legion of White Decency, white supremacist group and the main version of the Ku Klux Klan, came wearing white masks and burned the place down from the outside. The only way out was through a window, and it was Dick Hallorann who used his ability to find this exit. He also helped Will Hanlon, father of Mike Hanlon from the Losers Club from the main It story. In the aftermath of this incident, Dick saw a giant bird swooping down and flying away with the victims of this terrible tragedy, which makes Dick one of the very few adult individuals who can see the It entity in its various forms. Now, the thing is, the show changes some of this backstory. In Welcome to Derry, Dick Hallorann isn't really a cook, back far from it. He's someone that the senior officers of the Derry unit value a lot. Of course, it's because of his shining. Back when General Francis Shaw was just a child, he encountered It in the woods in the form of a gangly man. In his later years, he became obsessed with finding the source of this monstrosity so that he could weaponize it and use it to end the ongoing Cold War. As we said, the TV show is set in the 60s, not the 30s. That's why the Cold War is a thing in Welcome to Derry. Now, as for Hallorann, he's actually a colleague of Leroy Hanlon instead of Will Hanlon, because Will is still a preteen kid, so he definitely can't be in the army. But his dad, Leroy, is a flyboy and has formed an uncomfortable friendship with Hallorann, who's been assigned to use his ability to find the source of the evil that plagues Derry, which is how Hanlon and Hallorann form said bond. In the show too, Hallorann helps open the Black Spot, but things are going to get super uncomfortable later on. The fourth episode has a young Will Hanlon see a vision of his dead and burned father, who tells Will that even he would burn. Contrary to popular belief, we don't think Leroy is going to die in the show. You see, Andy Muschietti wants to maintain the continuity. We did see Leroy Hanlon in the first It movie as an old man who runs a slaughterhouse, is hated by Oscar Bowers, a racist cop. Anyways, that was Dick Hallorann's story while he was in Derry. What came after?
But you ain't got no business going in there anyway, so stay.
The Overlook Years, mentor and savior in The Shining. When people talk about The Shining, they usually jump straight to Jack Torrance and the Overlook Hotel, which is fair because they both have the same personality type. Volatile, loud, one push away from total collapse. But tucked neatly into Stephen King's world is Dick Hallorann, the cook with the shine, the man who knows how to read a room, only adult in that entire story who behaves like Jack is trying to fix his life. He's sober, ashamed, and desperate to believe that one winter job will save his marriage, his writing career, his own sense of worth. Wendy wants peace. Danny wants his parents to stop being at the brink of another heartbreak, and somewhere in Florida, Dick Hallorann is minding his business in a resort kitchen, no idea that the Overlook is about to drag him back into its mess. Before we even leave Colorado, Dick makes his first big entrance. It's shortly after the Torrances move in. Danny wanders into the kitchen, and Dick notices something unusual about the kid, not the polite small talk. Quiet way, Danny's mind feels like a radio signal turned all the way up, so Dick pulls Danny aside for a private chat. This is where he explains the Shine, the name his grandmother used for their psychic ability. He also drops two pieces of advice Danny will need later. One, ghosts at the Overlook behave like photos, form but no real power. Two, under no circumstances should Danny step into room 217. This would have been a nice mentor moment if not for one additional discovery. Dick tries to sense Danny's mind, but ends up with a burst of pain strong enough to make him realize that Danny might be the most powerful person he's ever met with the Shine. Hallorann leaves with an uneasy respect for the boy and a warning. There's trouble, you give a shout. Trouble doesn't wait long. Overlook, which behaves more like a manipulative relative than a haunted building, senses Danny's presence and uses him like a battery. It also focuses on Jack, who already sits on a pile of unresolved guilt, anger, professional insecurity. Jack finds an old scrapbook about the hotel's history. Presidents, celebrities, mob killings, the whole glamorous mess. He plans to turn it into a book, partly despite Ullman, manager who treated him like a ticking time bomb during the interview. Ullman, in turn, panics and calls Al Shockley, Jack's old friend who got him this job as a last chance. Al calms everyone down while Jack grudgingly agrees to behave. Meanwhile, Danny's visions escalate. Topiary animals stalk him, fire hose attacks him, and curiosity wins. Danny steals the passkey and enters room 217, where the bloated corpse of a murdered woman rises from the bathtub and tries to strangle him. Wendy sees the bruises around Danny's neck and immediately suspects Jack. Jack reacts exactly as the hotel wants. He sulks, fumes, retreats into the empty bar, and somehow finds it fully stocked. Alcohol returns to his system and the Overlook seizes complete access to his mind. He becomes its instrument. Wendy defends herself by hitting Jack with a straw-wrapped bottle, knocks him out, and locks him inside the pantry. But hotel has back Delbert Grady, former caretaker who murdered his family, opens the door for Jack. From there, things collapse fast. Jack destroys the snowmobile, he smashes the radio, a blizzard seals the road. The Torrances are cut off and Jack attacks Wendy with a croquet mallet, not the axe that the Kubrick movies prefer, and he breaks 3 ribs, leg, vertebrae. Wendy stabs him in the back and crawls away while Jack staggers after her. At this point, Jack is less husband and more puppet held together by alcohol, post-logic, Overlook's ambition to claim Danny's psychic power. And this is precisely when Dick Hallorann re-enters the story. Back in Florida, he hears Danny's psychic scream. Hallorann drops everything and heads for Colorado. The journey is a saga of its own. Icy roads, near accidents, plow driver who also shines and loans him handmade mittens. Dick pushes through the storm, switches to a snowmobile, arrives at the hotel. Before he even reaches the lobby, one of the hedge animals attacks him. He destroys it using gas from the snowmobile and a Zippo, then sprints to the entrance. Jack is waiting. He ambushes Hallorann with the croquet mallet, breaks his jaw, gives him a concussion, and follows Danny deeper into the hotel. Danny finally confronts him and tells him, "You're not my daddy." That one line disrupts the Overlook's control. Jack comes back for a moment, long enough to tell Danny that he loves him, to run. The hotel punishes Jack by forcing himself to hit himself with the mallet. Danny then remembers something crucial: boiler. Jack had been told from day one that the aging boiler must be dumped every day or it will explode. Chaos, Jack neglected it. Now the pressure is at a critical point. Jack, or whatever is left of him, rushes to the basement to save the Overlook. He opens the valve too late and the boiler explodes, ending Jack's life and destroying the hotel. The Overlook's spirit makes one desperate attempt to possess Hallorann and force him to kill Wendy and Danny. Dick refuses, shakes off the influence, and carries them to safety. The novel closes months later. Wendy and Danny spend the summer at a resort in Maine where Dick now works as head chef. Wendy recovers from her injuries, and Danny tries to make sense of the trauma. Hallorann teaches him to fish. Danny catches something, and for a moment, the boy smiles. That small, ordinary happiness is Dick Hallorann's real victory. Not the fight with the ghosts, the chance to give a damaged family one normal moment again. Helping Danny one more time. Remember how Dick told Danny about Black Grandpa and stuff? Well, that wasn't for naught. The real reason was that Black Grandpa was a bad shine and something had to be done about it. After Black Grandpa's death, White Grandma, aka Grandma Rose, got to know about the abuse that Dick had to suffer at her late husband's hands. She taught Dick how to lock these so-called bad shines in a mental lockbox of sorts. Hallorann then passes this information to Danny. Danny wasn't mature enough to create that mental lockbox, so Hallorann gives him a physical lockbox so that Danny could easily conceptualize locking away his own bad shines like Mrs. Massey, as well as Horace M. Derwent, another bad shine, and Overlook Hotel spirit. Many years after this meeting, decades actually, Danny once again seeks help from Hallorann. This time around, Danny had to protect his fellow shiner, Miss Abra Stone, from the True Knot cult's evil clutches. He called out to Hallorann once more, only to learn that Dick had passed away in the year 1999. Interestingly enough, that didn't stop Hallorann from speaking to Torrance. This time around, Hallorann spoke from beyond the grave through possessing the body of Eleanor Wiette. But this was the last time Hallorann would ever speak to Danny. It's safe to say that Dick Hallorann's story ended with this encounter. Building the Multiverse. Hallorann, the underrated hero, is King's universal connector. Dick Hallorann existed in The Shining without any hullabaloo, although one could say that he was something of a chosen one. He's simply the head cook at the Overlook Hotel, a man who has spent his life carrying a gift that most people never see and never want to believe in. Scatman Crothers plays him in Kubrick's adaptation, and Carl Lumbly later steps into the role in Dr. Sleep, but the essence of the character remains the same across every version. Dick understands the unseen, respects it, chooses to help others, others surviving. When he meets Danny Torrance during the Overlook's final day of regular operation, Dick immediately senses something extraordinary. Danny has the shine, not the mild kind that Dick grew up with. Danny's mind feels like a signal that could light the full length of the hotel. Dick explains the term the way his grandmother once explained it to him. He also tries to keep the conversation gentle. He knows what this kind of ability can do to a child, especially in a place with a history as vicious as the Overlook's. Dick also feels a wrongness hanging in the air. The Overlook isn't haunted in the old ghost story sense. It's haunted because enough cruelty has been soaked into its walls to give the building a personality. Dick has spent enough seasons at the hotel to know that its past doesn't remain dormant. And when Danny reaches out to him telepathically later that winter, terrified beyond speech, Dick treats the call with the seriousness most adults reserve for a 2 a.m. phone call from a loved one. He drops everything, faces a blizzard, heads straight for Colorado. Kubrick's film gives this moment a tragic weight. Hallorann barely steps through the door before Jack Torrance kills him with an axe. In the novel, however, Dick survives the violent confrontation and becomes a steady presence for Wendy and Danny afterwards. The two interpretations lead to different emotional payoffs. Motivation behind Dick's trip remains the same. He's one of the few adults in King's World who doesn't dismiss a frightened child. He listens, believes, and acts, even when it may cost him his life. After the Overlook's destruction in the novel, Dick becomes a kind of anchor for the two Torrances left alive. Wendy heals slowly, and Danny tries to rebuild his sense of safety. Dick helps them in the only way he knows, sharing knowledge, comfort, experience of someone who has lived with the Shine far longer. That mentorship follows Danny into adulthood, which is where Dr. Sleep picks up Red. In Dr. Sleep, Hallorann is no longer alive, but death has never been a firm boundary in King's Worlds. Carl Lumbly plays the spirit of Dick Hallorann. The character once again slips into the role that suits him best: guide, teacher, voice of reason. Danny, now grown and carrying decades of trauma, continues to deal with the psychic remnants of the Overlook. Dick returns to teach him a method that finally gives him control. He tells Danny to create lockboxes in his mind, mental vaults meant to trap the entities that claw at him. The lesson is simple on the surface, but emotionally heavy. Dick isn't passing down a magic trick, he's passing down a survival skill that he knows a younger him would have needed. These lockboxes later become the backbones of Danny's resilience, especially when the True Knot, group of psychic predators in Dr. Sleep, target children with the Shine. In Mike Flanagan's film adaptation, this training allows Danny to confront the Overlook itself one last time. Hallorann's influence remains a constant even after his death. He guides Danny through the fear the same way he guided him through Room 217's aftermath as a child. Hallorann also appears outside King's direct bibliography. Tabitha King mentions him in her novel Pearl, where he is found working in Key West. It's a small reference, but it reinforces something long understood about King's universe. His characters live beyond the boundaries of single books. They drift across geography, time, and stories because the larger thematic universe binds them together. Hallorann's cameo in Pearl is less about trivia and more about continuity. It signals that the Shine and the people who carry it exist across multiple corners of King's world. This interconnectedness isn't a gimmick. King often returns to the idea that evil repeats itself. Towns, families, and entire generations pass down history like scars. Stories such as The Stand and The Dark Tower explore this head-on. That same idea sits quietly within The Shining. Cycles of violence, cycles of addiction, cycles of fear, and alongside that, cycles of kindness. People like Dick Hallorann exist to remind readers that goodness can persist in the same world that births evils like Pennywise, the Crimson King, Overlook Hotel. What makes Dick Hallorann memorable isn't the Shine. The Shine may let him sense danger, communicate without words, and understand the supernatural. Those abilities aren't what defines him. That would be his decency. He pays attention, he trusts others' fear, and he acts on instinct when someone needs help. When a child signals distress across thousands of miles, Hallorann listens. When soldiers are trapped in a burning building in his earlier years, a detail told in It, he doesn't hesitate. He moves towards danger because that's who he is. There's a reason Mike Flanagan once considered a Hallorann-focused prequel. The character has depth that King only hints at, life shaped by experience, trauma, resilience, inner compass that somehow points towards empathy even when the world around him encourages the opposite. Why including Hallorann is a welcome move or Welcome to Derry. As Welcome to Derry expands King's mythology for television, Hallorann may once again bridge the gap between two of King's most infamous horrors, malevolence under Derry, violence embedded within the Overlook. And frankly, if there is anyone suited for that job, it's the man who has been shining since childhood and has survived every kind of darkness King's world has thrown at him. I mean, he's super important to the show for multiple reasons. First, he can sense what others can't, a place built on denial that makes him dangerous to the forces forces that thrive in the back. Second, he gives the story an adult perspective. Most tales set in Derry rely on children as the lens for fear. Hallorann disrupts that with a grown man who recognizes the truth, removes the safety net adults often hide behind, the idea that kids exaggerate, imagine, or misread danger. Third, he carries the thematic thread that binds the Overlook and Derry together. Both places feed on pain, both twist the minds of people who are vulnerable, both recognize the shine the way predators recognize the scent of prey. There's also something quietly bold about how the show portrays him. He isn't heroic yet, he stumbles, he resists certain duties, he avoids others. That space between reluctance and courage makes his arc more meaningful. When you meet him in The Shining, Dick is no longer the young man who questions his ability. He's already lived the worst parts of what the shine can reveal. Welcome to Derry shows you how he got. As the series expands Stephen King's mythology, Hallorann becomes the character who threads two of King's most terrifying landscapes together. He's a survivor of both, understands the kind of evil that doesn't die, kind that adapts, kind that hides inside old buildings with long memories. In a universe filled with supernatural forces that feed on fear, Hallorann proves something small but steady. Some people can face the darkness without cruelty or self-interest. Some people endure and even grow. And when that kind of person enters Derry, a town that eats its own children, the story gains a moral center it never had before. The show's version of Hallorann is not the man he becomes at the Overlook. You can see the pieces forming. The empathy is there, even if it's buried. The instinct to protect is there, even if he doesn't yet understand where it leads. And the terror he encounters in Derry becomes the foundation for the courage he later brings to a lonely hotel in Colorado. Another child will call for him across impossible distances. He will once again answer. That's all we got for you this time, folks, but if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.